This recording is protected by copyright. No part may be reproduced without the prior permission of the University of South Australia.
Good evening. My name is Jacinta Thompson and I'm the Executive Director and Events and Exhibitions Producer of the Bob Hawke Prime Ministerial Centre. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge that the land we meet on today is Kaurna land. We wish to express our respect for the Kaurna people, their elders and ancestors, and acknowledge the spiritual and cultural relationship the Kaurna people have with their traditional land. It gives me great pleasure to welcome you all here tonight on behalf of the Hawke Centre and the University of South Australia, as we hear from Professor the Honourable Gareth Evans, ACQC, discussing his latest book, Good International Citizenship, The Case For Decency. Gareth's book is the starting point for a wide-ranging discussion on current foreign policy issues with Emeritus Professor Hugh White, AO. I'm thrilled to welcome both Gareth and Hugh back to the Hawke Centre. It's always lovely to have you here. And Gareth presented our significant annual Hawke Lecture in 2003 and Hugh presented in 2014. And their presentations can be found on our website under Relive Our Events. I would also like to thank the publishers, Monash University Publishing. Gareth Evans was a Cabinet Minister throughout the Hawke-Keating governments, including as Foreign Minister from 1988 to 1996. In his 21-year parliamentary career, he served as both Leader of the Government in the Senate and Deputy Leader of the Opposition. After leaving politics, he was President of the Brussels-based International Crisis Group from 2000 to 2009 and Chancellor of the Australian National University from 2010 to 2019, where he is now Distinguished Honorary Professor. Hugh White is Emeritus Professor of Strategic Studies at the Australian National University. He has been an intelligence analyst, a journalist, a senior staffer to Australian Defence Minister Kim Beazley and Prime Minister Bob Hawke, and a senior official in the Australian Defence Department. He was the principal author of Australia's 2000 Defence White Paper. So a very warm welcome to Gareth Evans and Hugh White. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jacinta, for that very kind welcome, and thanks to the Hawke Centre and your team for getting us both here and getting all these lovely people here tonight on a cold Adelaide night. I come from Canberra, so this doesn't quite count as a cold night, but coolish Adelaide night. To talk to Gareth a bit about his new book. It's, I guess, particularly fitting to do this in the Hawke Centre because, of course, Bob and Gareth worked so closely together. One of the pleasures of my professional life was to be involved in watching those two working together when I was working for Bob and Gareth was Foreign Minister, and watching them, those two figures, giants I'm allowed to say, of Australian politics and policy working closely together was a real education. Bob was occasionally given to hyperbole, as some of you may know, but he was quite serious when he used to say, I won't do my Hawke imitation, but when he used to say, I mean, Gareth really is the best Foreign Minister Australia's ever had, isn't he, Hugh? I mean, there's no doubt about that. We'd have a little debate about that. I'd nominate a couple of competitors, but I won't take on Gareth and suggest who they might have been now. But it really was true that the chemistry between them, not always complete alignment, of course, but the chemistry between them was pretty inspiring to see. And I do think there's a reason why Bob thought that Gareth was Australia's best Foreign Minister, because his achievements as Foreign Minister are pretty much unmatched in two ways, both his extraordinary capacity to achieve practical results, and we could spend the evening going through the list of things that Gareth actually got done as Foreign Minister, which really reflect the energy, the imagination, the determination and attention to detail, which was an education to see. But also because Gareth was always a very deep thinker and remains a very deep thinker about these things. I think it's true to say that there's no Australian and very few others of other nationalities globally who have made as big a contribution to the development of what you might call the software, the intellectual software, the set of ideas that are used to manage international affairs as Gareth has. And he did that not just as Foreign Minister, but with astonishing energy and continuity since he stopped being a politician and started being one of the many other things he's been since then. And now with impeccable timing, Gareth has made another contribution, setting out his big ideas in a commendably concise book. There's a lot to be said for a book that you can fit in your suit coat pocket, and this passes that test. Commendably concise, but full of interest and very important ideas. And his timing, as I say, is impeccable because we are at a pretty significant moment globally and regionally and nationally. Globally, because the international order that we thought had been established with the end of the Cold War is coming apart in our hands. Regionally, because in particular it's coming apart in our part of the world with all of the developments that we've seen over the last few years and months and even the last few weeks. And nationally, of course, because we've had what I think is the most khaki election campaign probably since 1966. That is an election campaign in which questions of foreign and defence policy have loomed larger than they have at any time since the Vietnam influenced election campaigns of 66. And also because, of course, the result of that was a new government with all the sense of possibility and potential and even, dare I say it, excitement that a new government can deliver. And so at this perfect moment, Gareth has delivered a very clear and very powerful set of messages about the way we should think about foreign policy. The heart of it is in the title, Good International Citizenship, the Case for Decency. And what we want to do is to just talk our way through that, talk through some of the arguments, and then spend a little bit of time talking about some of the big issues that are kicking around in the world and in Australia today. And so, Gareth, I want to start just by asking you to take us through the big idea at the heart of the book.
Well, thanks very much, Hugh, for that introduction. After that, there's really nowhere to go but down. I think I'm always reminded on these occasions of Adlai Stevenson's famous line. He said, "Flattery is all right as long as you don't inhale." So, anyway, thanks, Hugh. I don't get many introductions like that these days, so I'm going to bask. Look, it's a very little book. It's really only an essay. It's a bit of flattery to call it a book. But what it is trying to re-establish in the minds of our policymakers the concept of good international citizenship as a national interest in its own right. Everybody gets it that foreign policy basically has to be about national interests. But really the focus when people talk about national interests is on the traditional duo of strategic security interests on the one hand and economic prosperity interests on the other. And the other stuff that governments do, or we'd like them to do, some of us would like them to do when it comes to aid and when it comes to advancing human rights internationally, when it comes to responding to disasters elsewhere, environmental disasters, natural disasters, when it comes to getting engaged in responding to atrocity crimes that are occurring elsewhere, when it comes to trying to do peacekeeping operations elsewhere in countries way outside our own area of interest, all of these things tend to be regarded by the hardheads in government. There's a lot of hardheads, a lot of cynics in government, as sort of optional extras. These are not the real business of foreign policy. The real business of foreign policy is the traditional security stuff and the traditional economic trade prosperity stuff. And the other stuff is what you do when there's some pressure group domestically pushing you to do it, or when you've got some spare resources and money available and it's not really competing for other more compelling domestic priorities. I've got a different view about that. I think it's very, very important that we see the pursuit of decency in the conduct of our international relations, the pursuit of what I like to call good international citizenship, as really just a very fundamental dimension of what the conduct of international relations should be about. What I mean by being a decent country, what I mean by being a good international citizen, is a country that others warm to, trust, want to emulate. A country that is perceived as being not just consumed with its own narrow self-interest, but has in mind, as in terms of its approach to the world, a commitment to making the world at large a safer, saner, just and more compelling environment. And it's very important, I think, that countries like Australia play into that particular role, that particular perception. We've done it periodically in the past, but not nearly enough, particularly in recent times. And I believe that it's very important that we recreate the sense of priority that's associated with our commitment to these issues. A decent country, a good international citizen, is a country that takes seriously the moral obligation to try to alleviate poverty, that takes seriously the moral obligation to do the best we possibly can to get respect for universal human rights. A country which takes seriously the obligation to do what we can to advance peace and security in countries, to contribute to peacemaking, to peacekeeping where we can. A country that takes seriously its obligations to deal compassionately with the victims of war and atrocity crimes, particularly refugees. And a country which takes seriously the attempts to try to address these big existential risks of which we've now become much more acutely aware. And those risks of pandemics, associated with pandemics, with climate change, and of nuclear war. So these are the things that make up, I believe, a decent country. And the argument of this book is that there's not only a moral imperative to do this stuff, because it's the right thing to do, but it's also a national interest imperative, and I spell that out.
Yeah, well, thanks. Thanks, Hugh. I mean, that point you just touched on, that you do have quite a sophisticated argument in the book about the fact that there's, as you say at one point, you can ride two horses at once. On the one hand, you think we should be taking the kind of approaches you've just described simply because it's the right thing to do, and you have quite an emphasis on that. And I guess embedded in that is your sense that states have the same kind of obligations as individuals to behave in a moral fashion, no matter how you derive the moral arguments. You are saying that states should have that responsibility, but you also make the point that, in fact, enlightened self-interest encourages you to do the same thing anyway, particularly if you think in the long term. And I wonder if you could just spell out that argument for us a bit.
Yeah, well, I think the moral imperative does need more than just assertion, because you do need to get a sense of what the source of your moral reasoning is, what the foundation of it is. And of course, there are many sources. They can be religiously sourced, your sense of moral imperative, or they can be humanistically sourced or based on very different philosophical traditions. I mean, for the academics among you, there's the sort of choice that I worked my way through during my progression from, sort of being an intuitionist to being a Kantian to being a utilitarian to being a Rawlsian. There's all. Penny Wong was quite entranced by this. She said that her intellectual journey as an undergraduate philosopher pretty much mirrored mine. But the point I wanted to make about the moral imperative stuff is that although there are many different ways of climbing the same mountain when you're trying to identify appropriate sources of moral reasoning which you find compelling, there's really a common element that runs through the moral reasoning that we associate with many different philosophical traditions, many different religious traditions, many different cultural traditions. And that common element is a really common commitment to the essential dignity and humanity of mankind, our common humanity. And that sense of common humanity and the moral obligation, whatever tradition we're brought up in, that we should feel that we have, is at the heart of that dimension of good international citizenship. But the point I really, really want to make, and I made it all the years I was foreign minister, and I'm trying to get it back into the discourse again, is that it's more than just a warm inner glow, the reasons for doing this sort of stuff. It's more than just a moral compulsion. It is something that should appeal to the realists among us, the cynics, the hardheads, those who say that the only serious motivations for political activity should be the pursuit of those traditional, hard-headed, very visible national interests in security and prosperity. And what I say to those who are sceptical about the compelling character of the obligations I'm talking about is that there's at least three kinds of hard-headed national interest that one can identify. The first is reputational. There's absolutely no question that countries that are good international citizens, whose behaviour reflects commitment and effective operational delivery of things right across that spectrum I've talked about, are countries that others do take seriously. Countries that they respect, that they want to trade with, they want to invest with, they want to visit, they want to study in. They're happy engaging in trusting security relationships. They're happy in working with, in the context of international institutional apparatus set up to try to wrestle with problems of peace and security. Countries with that kind of reputational aura about them are countries that do benefit very directly from the response of other people to them. There's a kind of ironic example I deliberately use, and I use it because I want to make the point that what's involved in being a good international citizen is more than just Boy Scout good deeds. And that's the case of Sweden. I mean, just an example. Absolutely squeaky clean Sweden. Fantastic record in human rights advocacy, fantastic record in commitment to peacekeeping and peacemaking, fantastic record in right across the whole spectrum of global, public goods issues, and aid, of course, among them. And Sweden also happens to be one of the world's biggest suppliers of conventional arms. Kockums, Bofors, Saab, because it's the kind of country that absolutely everybody feels comfortable dealing with, as we did with the Collins-class submarines for a start. There are benefits, and of course this has been articulated very well by Joe Nye and all his writing about soft power. We now understand much better than we used to the concept of soft power, the power that comes from a country's reputation, from having the kind of culture and the kind of behaviour politically, governmentally, that others want to emulate. The second hard-headed return is reciprocity. It's a perfectly common feature of ordinary everyday life that those who are sympathetic to, when we're sympathetic to someone else's concerns and problems and do our best to help resolve them, even though we get no immediate return, that other person is that much more inclined to be supportive of us when we run into strife. And so it works internationally. If we support other countries' problems with terrorism or natural disaster response or whatever, it's that much easier to get them to support us when we want their support in questions of international people trafficking or refugee flows or issues of that particular kind. And of course, it's easier to get their support when it comes to votes for positions that we're chasing in international forums and so on. The concept of reciprocity is sometimes pretty subtle, sometimes pretty understated, but nobody's been in this business would fail to understand what I'm talking about. And if you are the kind of country that is seen to be responsive to other people's interests, not just your own, there's all sorts of advantages that flow from that. The third advantage is simply what collaborative, cooperative international behaviour, the mindset of a good international citizen, brings to the solution of global public goods problems, in particular the big ones, the big existential risk problems, pandemics, climate change and so on, is that much easier to get things done in those collective action problem areas when you bring to it a mindset of cooperative, collaborative citizenship, global citizenship. These are, in many cases, there are sort of tough issues for countries to commit themselves to because there's downside negatives involved. Climate's the obvious one for Australia with our fossil fuel commitments and so on, our reliance. And there are many countries that have similar inhibitions about throwing themselves fully into the resolution of these big global problems from which everyone benefits if you can get cooperative solutions. So all I'm saying is, if more countries approach this in the kind of spirit that I'm advocating, then we'd be a lot better off in terms of getting that stuff done.
So one of the things you do in the book is to give a kind of a scorecard of how Australia's gone on a lot of those issues, the issues you've mentioned. And I wonder if you could just run through and give us a quick summary of how you think we've gone on aid, for example. Let's start with aid.
Well, the overall analysis is patchy, lamentable at worst, and in recent years particularly embarrassingly poor. When it comes to aid, just quickly running through the four big benchmarks, and I basically identify them: aid, human rights, contributions to peace and security, and contributions to the resolution of these big existential risk problems. On aid, the performance currently is lamentable. We are at the lowest ebb we've, I think, ever been, with aid trending down to the global gold standard is 0.7 of development assistance as a proportion of gross national income. We are down now below, hovering around 0.2% and projected to go lower. We have the worst record of any developed country in terms of the decline of our aid commitment over the course of the last 50 years. The extent of our aid, if you do it in apples for apples terms, is about a half of what it was in the Morrison years. It was about a half what it was under the Menzies years. I mean, that's how much the commitment has deteriorated. And we are the 12th or 13th richest country in the world. We can do much, much, much better than that. When it comes to human rights, of course, when you're talking about the human rights thing, what you do domestically is almost as important as what you do internationally, because unless there's a correlation between the two, if you talk the talk but don't deliver the walk, then you're just seen properly as a complete hypocrite. Australia's record has been on and off, both domestically and internationally. We've had our high points, we've had our low points. Our high points internationally, I suppose, after many years of contrary behaviour, was in particular under Bob Hawke, the hugely important role we played in the destruction of apartheid. That was the classic human rights exercise, and we were very much up front in our advocacy, in particular the notion of financial sanctions, which was the critical turning point. We haven't done nearly so well recently. I won't go into our performance on Israel-Palestine, which is controversial and difficult, but I feel passionately that we've dropped the ball on both sides of politics on that issue. On Myanmar, we've dropped the ball. I mean, initially it was because we had an Australian imprisoned there, which we had to go softly because we didn't want to prejudice that. But you know, our performance in terms of even embracing the most basic international sanctions has been lamentably weak. And of course, if you allow yourself to, you can get caught up in the problems of hostage diplomacy if you allow yourself to be dissuaded from taking strong action. So look, human rights is a mixed sort of story, and we could talk about it all night. In terms of the third category of peace and security contributions, we've done well enough in the past in peacemaking in areas outside our immediate concern, but where we've made a big difference. And I guess the Cambodia peace enterprise was as good an example as you can find of Australia sort of punching above its weight in that space. On peacekeeping, we've been in the past hugely respected and significant international contributors, not least because Australians as peacekeepers are brilliant in the role because of our cultural disposition to take people as we find them. And I think you can generalise about this, not to either suck up or to kick down. We're very, very good, Australians, in community peacekeeping situations. And we've had, over the years, significant Australian commitments to UN-mandated peacekeeping operations. But now, how many peacekeepers do we have in the field? It's not thousands, not hundreds. It's less than 50 spread over 4 missions and 3 continents. And it's just a trivial commitment to what is a very, very important good international citizenship obligation. When it comes to refugees and dealing with the consequences, when it comes to atrocity crimes in response to genocide and crimes against humanity, Australia has actually played quite a leading role. Australians, in initially introducing the concept of responsibility to protect and getting it through the World Summit in 2005. We can talk in more detail about this if you'd like later on. It's been mixed in terms of its efficacy, but the normative principle that's associated has been a big step forward. And I have to say that this is one area where both sides of politics have been consistently supportive. Under the Morrison and previous coalition governments, there's been financial support for the global centre that I continue to chair in this subject, and strong ministerial commitment. I can't say that about much else in the multilateral space or the UN space, but I can say it about that. On refugees and treating the consequences of atrocity crimes and conflict, our record has been absolutely lamentable. And I have to say that again on both sides of politics. The race to the bottom after Tampa, in the context of Tampa, has just been there for all of us to see. We had to take strong measures, obviously, to deal with the horrors of deaths at sea and people smugglers. And it's still defensible, I think, to have boat pushbacks, provided you have arrangements with neighbouring countries, so you're not pushing boats back for people to drown just in someone else's sea. But the notion of offshore processing as being absolutely indispensable to keeping our borders safe and secure, I think is demonstrably nonsense, and our treatment of people whose lives are just on hold because of their uncertain status or the way they've been treated offshore and onshore in Australia leaves a huge amount to be done. And I hope our silence on this issue during the campaign, while understandable enough in terms of not wanting to be wedged as with other khaki issues, I hope that silence won't continue, and I hope we do get a bit of decency into our refugee and asylum seeker policy, because it's been manifestly lacking. On the last area of the existential risk stuff and what sort of contribution we've made there, on pandemics, well, it's sort of a bare pass, I guess, in terms of I'm talking about our international response. We haven't been as effective as we should have been in operationally delivering on vaccine commitments in the Pacific, to Papua New Guinea in particular, and we've been behind the eight ball in terms of our commitments globally to the COVAX scheme. But, you know, a bare pass may be. On climate, you hardly need me to tell you how lamentable the record has been, how significant a factor that was, of course, in the recent election, and how we all hope that that will change. But our reputation is that of a complete laggard on this subject internationally, and it's done us real reputational damage right around the world. On nukes, I could say a heck of a lot on that subject, because that's a particular passion of mine. Australia has in the past played a not insignificant role in the international normative debate. The Canberra Commission that we established in the last days of the Hawke, of the Keating government in '96, did establish a whole momentum in terms of making the normative case for the ultimate elimination of these most indiscriminately inhumane weapons ever invented. And Kevin Rudd appointed another commission, which I co-chaired with the former Japanese foreign minister in 2007, which again sort of articulated a very detailed case, not only for ultimate elimination, which is still a pretty remote goal, and even more so in recent times, but how you actually get there, this by a step-by-step process of nuclear risk reduction. So we've made these sort of intellectual contributions to the international debate about nuclear weapons, but we've just gone missing in recent years when it comes to any kind of advocacy. One touchstone issue in this respect, which is actually very important, is a doctrinal commitment by the nuclear weapon states to no first use of nuclear weapons. If you want risk reduction, that's got to be at least a start. You've got to support it by other measures, reduced deployments and taking weapons off hair trigger alert and so on, to make that a doctrinal commitment seriously credible in practice. But the doctrinal commitment is the threshold. The United States has been wrestling with this. Obama wanted to go down that particular path. Joe Biden, as vice president, was very articulate about doing just that. And there was a lot of hope that during the most recent nuclear posture review in the United States, that America would actually move down that direction and start defusing the sense that nuclear weapons were actually usable. But of course, the allies ganged up, the umbrella states ganged up, Japan, Korea, and Northeast Asia, the Europeans, predictably, and Australia was very much among them. Horror, we said. No first use, my God. We want to keep, we're potential beneficiaries of US nuclear deterrence, and we don't want to, under any circumstances, minimise, the nature of that commitment to the use of nuclear weapons if that's going to be helpful to our defence. I think it's complete nonsense, that position, and I think it's indefensible morally, but it's a position that Australian governments have continued to take, and it badly needs to change. So the record, when you work your way through, there's lots of things I could have said on the positive side. For example, is the Indigenous Paul Keating's Redfern speech, but more particularly Kevin Rudd's Stolen Generation speech, which did resonate all the way around the world. Let me tell you, I travel a lot. That was noticed. That was a classic sense that Australia was getting its act together on a critical human rights issue, and therefore giving us more credibility when we seek to raise, as we don't do very often these days, human rights issues elsewhere. There's lots of things on both sides of the ledger, and I've spent more than 50 pages of the 80-odd pages in this essay describing fairly systematically where we've done reasonably well, but where we've done lamentably badly. And overall, the record is not good and it badly needs redressing.
One of the things you focus on in the book a lot at points is the fact that the politics of these sorts of approaches, often seen by the hardheads to be very difficult, but in fact, the politics can be made to work well for them.
Well, the last part of this essay is really, in many ways, the most important. It's called The Politics of Decency. And it starts with the common perception, Mrs. Jellyby in Bleak House, some of you will recognise, that the charity begins at home. That really electorates, most people are really much more concerned about what they can see and feel and people around them than they are in other people in faraway places. But when you drill down, when you actually explore the public opinion polls on this issue, it tells you a very different story. And the Lowy Institute in Sydney has been doing extensive polling on these subjects now, right across the spectrum of benchmarks issues that I mentioned for the last 15 years. And over again, every single area you look at, whether it's response to atrocity crimes, whether Australia should be, pursuing capital punishment, reduction abroad, and so on and so forth, abolition, the very, very strong majorities in the Australian population for doing the right thing, for being a decent, good international citizen. On the face of it, there's one exception, often remarked on: aid. There's a belief strongly embedded, certainly in the conservative side of politics, that Australian public just will not support any increases in aid and will be in fact entirely relaxed about the huge reductions in aid that we've seen in recent years. And they've drawn on some opinion poll evidence, including from the Lowy Institute itself in 2017, which, much quoted by conservative development ministers, there was a 73% majority of people saying that we were spending basically too much and it should be reduced. And they were responding to a question that was put to them. This is what we're spending now, $3.8 billion, I think the figure was. Do you think that should be reduced? And most people said yes. But the next year, Lowy decided to drill down and just see what was underneath that particular reflex response, and whether it was really the case that we were a country that was very ungenerous when it came to aid commitments. And what they found was this. They asked a different question. Instead of giving a particular figure and saying, is that too much? They said, how much do you think we should be spending as a country on aid as a proportion of the federal budget? Not some abstract concept of GDP or GNI, but the national budget. How much do you think we are spending? And how much, second question, how much do you think we should be spending? The results are very illuminating. When asked how much people thought we were spending, they said, on average, $14 in every $100 of the federal budget, 14%. And they said, that's too much, that's too much. How much should we be spending? $10, 10% of the federal budget. In fact, of course, we were spending then, and it's even less now, 80 cents, 0.8%. And so the reality was people thought we were spending 17.5 times as much as we actually were, But we're prepared to see us spend 10 and a half times as much as we actually were. So that tells you, I think, and it reinforces what we know to be the essential generosity of Australians and their response to Aceh tsunamis and everything else. And, there is this willingness to embrace politically good international citizenship. I don't know whether this stuff ever actually wins you elections, to be very articulate and very clear about it. Although, of course, we have to say this election, climate was unquestionably a game changer in the election. But I do think it's clear that there's no evidence whatsoever that taking a strong position on these issues will lose you elections. And I think that's something that our more cynical and hard-headed politicians ought to bear in mind. The truth of the matter is Australia is a country which has shown in the past that as a creative, energetic middle power, we can make a difference in all sorts of ways. We are the 12th or 13th largest economy in the world, depending on the way in which you count these things, and we can afford to be good international citizens. So my argument to Penny Wong, Penny sort of likes the actual operational side of this and said, yes, let's do all this. She's not so sure about the concept of good international citizenship. She prefers, what does she prefer? International, something rather, I've got it here. It makes the point, I think. International something, constructive internationalism, that's what it is. Well, I don't think constructive internationalism takes you very far. I think being a good international citizen is a sharper and cleaner way of articulating not just the moral imperative, but again, to repeat, the national interest imperative. This is where you square the circle between idealism and realism, where pragmatism really makes a difference. And if, people think that's a bit of a complicated story to tell, that you can be simultaneously idealistic and pragmatic, well, I'll remind them, as I often do in other contexts, of that wonderful line from the Scottish Labour MP Jimmy Maxton in the 1930s. If they can't ride two bloody horses, they shouldn't be in the bloody circus. And I think that's a storyline that is repeated when we come to other aspects of foreign policy.
Yeah. Gareth, let's switch now and just look at some of the current issues that the new government finds on its plate as it moves into the ministerial wing. The first one, I guess, that we're all thinking about is Ukraine. Hugely complicated.
Well, Ukraine actually is a classic example of Australian good international citizenship at work in a peace and security issue, and the very strong bipartisan support that we've seen for responding to Russia's legally and morally indefensible assault on Ukraine is clearly a position that's not born of any concerns about security returns to us. We're not going to benefit or suffer one way or the other from what happens over there. Maybe in terms of the larger norms of the global order, yes, we'll be disbeneficiaries if things stay pear-shaped. But this is not an area of direct security response to us, for us to be imposing sanctions, nor is it an area of economic concern to us. Yes, our farmers will probably benefit from wheat prices going up, but equally energy prices also going up are going to be a real problem for the Australian economy as everywhere else. So this is not a case where getting involved and playing our part in the global, or at least Western response to Ukraine is anything other than an exercise of good international citizenship. I just want to put that on the record. We could spend a long time debating Ukraine and what the hell's going to happen. I fear that we're heading towards a sort of frozen conflict situation because of the inability of Putin to presumably back away without getting something in his pocket that he didn't have before, and Zelensky's perfectly understandable reluctance to go beyond what he's already put on the table, neutrality and non-joining NATO. If there's no pullback of the terrible suffering and the territorial gains that the Russians have made, particularly in the corridor to Crimea. So it's very, very tough. There's all sorts of people putting their two penneth into how we should be resolving this. It has to be one for the Ukrainians to make their own judgments about what they think they can put on the table, but it's got all the makings to me of one of those frozen conflict situations which is going to continue for a long time. It's critically important, I think, that the West maintain its coherence in response, because this is the biggest assault on the rules of the international order post-1945 that we've seen by a considerable margin. Oh, the Americans perhaps 2003, Iraq is not a great example, but this is really serious because it's just tearing up the rule book, and it's terribly important that we sustain our response to it.
Yeah.
But of course, that's not the real challenges that Australian foreign policy has got to confront are closer to home. It's navigating it's resetting the relationship with China, it's navigating our relationship with the United States, it's the business of developing much stronger relationships with key countries in our own neighbourhood. It's also the business of restoring diplomacy to centre stage. Those are the big four challenges for Australian policy, apart from the one that we've been talking about the last half hour, which is restoring credibility to our reputation as a good international citizen. So they're the issues on which I would be trying to get the Australian government to really focus.
Where do you think we should go on the China story?
Well, Hugh is world expert on this subject, and he's got a new publication coming out, yet another quarterly essay. So he'll have some very interesting things to say. I mean, my take on it is that we have to recognise the reality of China's rise, of China's likely ultimate, and I'm with Hugh on this, likely ultimate supremacy in our own region. I don't think the Americans can hold the position of primacy, preeminence, predominance they're so politically insistent on asserting forever. I think the reality of our relationship with China economically shrieks out at us with huge proportion of our exports, more than a third going there, and just a huge amount of dependence and a huge amount of necessity for us to accommodate ourselves to the reality. At the same time, so we have to get along with China. And other countries in the region have been doing that despite their many reservations about China's recent behaviour. And Japanese are a good example of that. But at the same time, of course, we also have to stand up to, and we do have to push back when China overreaches. It manifestly has externally, South China Sea, maybe, although Hugh and I think, are in agreement that this pudding has been a little over-egged in the Solomon Islands and some of the stuff they're up to in the Pacific. But China's certainly been behaving very badly in terms of internal human rights issues with the Uyghurs, with Hong Kong, and with Tibet, classic examples. And, we can't just be silent on those issues because they go not just to Australian values, but to universal values. And it's important that the world make clear its distaste for, the tearing up of decency in all those ways. And very important that the region make clear its unwillingness to be just reduced to the status of vassals by a kind of China that's over-asserting its sovereignty. So it's again those two horses we have to ride between standing up and getting along, between deterrence and engagement, between But what we have to do is recognise that in terms of the bilateral relationship, Australia's not been entirely innocent in the terrible deterioration that we've seen over recent years. I would attribute most of the blame, if you like, to the overreach by China, which has made it very difficult for any country which values its own integrity and its own commitment to universal values, not to respond to. But, we really have overdone the stridency of the rhetoric on a Gothic scale, not least since Malcolm Turnbull in 2017. And Peter Dutton's war talk is just indefensibly provocative and wrong-headed and, triumph of trying to generate a khaki election in Australia over any rational conduct of international relations. We've overdone it in terms of our economically those cases of I'm having a senior moment. When you're misapplying the trade rules to try to trying to, anti-dumping.
Yes.
Sorry. We have gone to town in a big way in terms of generating anti-dumping enterprise against China, which have been completely indefensible economically and very provocative and seen so as China. So, there's that sort of stuff. And when you do the ledger, there are all sorts of ways we can start moving forward. I mean, I don't think we should over-respond to the overtures that we are now seeing from China. They've obviously realised they've overdone the wolf warrior stuff generally, and certainly in relation to Australia. They do see the necessity to reset the relationship. But, so long as they do have these heavy-duty sanctions in place against us, so long as they're, I think, indefensibly detaining Australian citizens, there's a couple detained right now in very murky circumstances, we can't just roll over and say, oh, you want to talk to us, that's fantastic. We do have to maintain our own dignity, because China does unquestionably respect strength and is contemptuous of weakness. But all of that said, what we're capable of doing with a bit of intelligent diplomacy is navigating our way back to a much more constructive relationship. There's always issues where we're going to be highly competitive. As with the United States, we're going to be almost adversarial. But there's plenty of areas for cooperation, including on those public goods issues like climate. And I think, with a bit of sensible navigation, maybe the context of the 50th anniversary of the establishment of Australian relations with China, which comes up in December this year, will be the occasion for both sides to move towards some sort of way of defusing the situation. But it's a very tricky one.
And I mean, obviously, the other side of that coin is how we relate to the United States, because so much of the way our relationship with the United States has evolved, particularly over the last few years, has been the other side of the China story. Is it going to be possible for us to rebuild the kind of relationship with China that we want, the one that strikes the balance, as you have mentioned, without making some significant changes to the way we're talking to Washington about these issues? And AUKUS, of course, is very much at the centre of that.
I've just come back from 2 weeks in the United States, New York, Washington, and Boston, and it continues to worry me that on both sides of US politics, it's not just the Trumpians, there's a real failure to accommodate themselves intellectually and politically to the reality of China's position now in the world. I don't find anyone repeating what I heard from Bill Clinton's lips in a private gathering. I've often quoted, I'll quote it again because I think it just summarises exactly where America's thinking ought to be, but where it is not now. And this is at a gathering which I happened to be present in 2002, 2 years after he left the presidency, in which he said, look, America's got two choices about the way in which we use this great and unrivaled economic and military power that we have. In 2002, it was still unrivaled. Choice number one is to use this power to try to stay top dog on the global bloc in perpetuity. Choice number two is to use that power to create a world in which we are comfortable living when we are no longer top dog on the global bloc. And I thought that was just pitch perfect. It recognised the reality, the dawning reality of just how important China was going to be. It recognised the absolute necessity for a cooperative, collaborative relationship rather than a dogged insistence on remaining global number one. It recognised the necessity to accommodate China's desire, now very strong, very visible, not just to be a global rule taker anymore, but a global rule maker, and to play a significant decision-making role in global institutions. It has to recognise the necessity for China to have some strategic space of its own. It's just not going to accommodate itself to being bottled up in that first island chain that the Americans are so determined to keep it locked into. You've just got to accept those realities, and we're a very long way from accepting them. I don't think any of this means that we should walk away from the US alliance, but we should be hard-headed and clear-sighted about the reality of that alliance and what it will bring us. I'm one of those who, although I'm very conscious of the language of the ANZUS Treaty, America will act in the case of Australia being in desperate struggle, desperate straits, but it doesn't say what form that action has to take. It certainly doesn't say it has to be military. And my belief, I'm afraid, is that knowing the Americans as well as I do, as well as Hugh does, and he might want to contest this, that I just can't see the Americans throwing everything into our protection should we get into existential strife in the future, if at the same time they don't see their own interests as being at stake. If they do see their interests as being at stake, yes, then we will benefit. But none of that means walking away from the alliance. We've benefited from it in terms of technology, material, intelligence. And I think we will benefit from the AUKUS relationship. We can have a long debate about AUKUS, and Hugh and I have been having this debate over a period, and I've got some sympathy with his position that maybe my instincts notwithstanding, we don't really need nuclear-propelled submarines at all, but with the same amount of money that we're going to spend, gigantic amount of money we're going to spend on these things, we have a much bigger fleet of nifty, mobile, conventional subs, which might not do the same job as the other ones in places further afield, closer to China, would certainly be very effective in defending us against any assault coming through the archipelago to our north or from around the corner. And I think that's story that has to be worked through before we finally irrevocably commit ourselves to what on the face of it's a fairly attractive proposition. So look, just how you navigate. Look, just the final point I'd make about relations with America. You do best in having our voice heard and having our interests genuinely protected when America doesn't see us as an easy workover. If we, loll around, pink tummy exposed, forepaws waving, tongue lolling, we are going to be treated that way by the United States. And I've got plenty of examples of that from my own experience. I think just to give you one, which has always been very clear in my mind. Jim Baker, then Secretary of State, called me up when I was Foreign Minister. He was Secretary of State. On one occasion, and early on in my term as Foreign Minister, said, look, you guys and we are very keen on bringing to conclusion the Chemical Weapons Convention. It's been stuck in Geneva, UN negotiations for 20 years. We want to unstick it. This is important. But we're too big and ugly to get the job done. We've got too much of the global chemical industry located. People think we're going to be working to protect that rather than da-da-da. We just can't get the job done. But listen, you guys can. Not least because, and this is the nub of the conversation, almost in these terms, you've been giving us a really hard time lately on a bunch of issues. I think China, MFN, most favoured nation, was a complicated issue. That was one of the issues of the day. You've been giving us a pain in the arse, basic ass, in the way in which you've been behaving. But in doing so, you basically demonstrated that you're not here doing our bidding. You're an independent country making up your mind, doing your own stuff. And as such, we think we can work very cooperatively with you, playing the lead role in getting this job done. And the rest is history. We did get the job done. We mounted a great big international conference in Canberra, bringing together the world's chemical weapons industry with governments, and we led the negotiations through months and months and months of difficult stuff, but we got there in Geneva and New York. So, and we did it because America saw the utility of us being a genuinely independent player. So that's the real trick with AUKUS. I mean, I think with the submarines, I do take seriously what was said by the Secretary of State and Secretary of Defence of the United States at the time of the AUKUS announcement, when they said there'd be no quid pro quo for this, no commit. Well, I'm not so sure that that's what they really have in mind, because there's a real risk of here being so operationally enmeshed in United States decision-making that our independence will suffer. But sure as hell, this government, any future Australian government, if we do go down the path of this new relationship, are going to have to insist that there is no quid pro quo, and so far as humanly possible, we maintain operational independence and policy-making independence when it comes to this thing. So navigating this, getting the benefit of such protection as it is we get from the United States, such benefit as we obviously do from the United States, while at the same time not becoming a complete dependent acolyte of the United States is a tricky course for any government. And I'm more confident that the Labor government will navigate that than I ever could be of the other side. But nonetheless, we need perhaps a little bit more mojo on that subject than we've been demonstrating in recent times, as we've sought to avoid any crack of daylight opening between us and the other side of politics to avoid a khaki election. Now we're past the khaki election stage. We are in the business of government. So now it's the time to start asserting just a little bit more independence.
So very briefly, Southwest Pacific and Southeast Asia. I think we'd agree that Australian diplomacy has sagged in our own region in recent times.
Yeah, well, I mean, unquestionably, and I think it's very, very good that it's just been announced that Albanese will be going to Indonesia as his first major bilateral visit. That's absolutely the right thing to do. Absolutely the right thing to do to pursue much strengthened relationships with the key players. Obviously Japan, obviously South Korea, obviously Indonesia, obviously also Vietnam. And I do give credit to Morrison for actually going to Vietnam, and one of the few places he did visit. Maybe it's because run by a lot of illiberal authoritarians, but never mind. But nonetheless, Vietnam is very important, because when the Vietnamese choose to set their minds on something, they do get things done, and they've got a traditional, as we remember, and they've got a relationship of genuine arm's length with China. So they're important. India is obviously supremely important, getting that relationship right. Rather difficult with Modi at the moment, having such an uncomfortable domestic agenda. But the South, and ASEAN itself, I think we can forget about, unfortunately. But as a collective, with Cambodia and Laos being wholly owned subsidiaries of China, and authoritarian governments in Thailand and Philippines and Myanmar, and Singapore and Malaysia being, good solid allies, but not big enough players to really make a difference. I mean, can I just give one little anecdote which makes the point of where we are now as compared with where we have been and where we should be? During the course of the Cambodian negotiations, one of those many big international conferences hosted in Jakarta, morning coffee break, I was looking for a room down a corridor to make a phone call, and I opened a door, and inadvertently there were 5 of my ASEAN foreign ministerial colleagues sitting there having a cup of coffee around a table. I said, sorry to intrude, didn't mean to. And they said, come on in. Yeah. You're one of us. One of us. Can anyone imagine Maurice Payne getting that kind of invitation? I mean, we just haven't put ourselves in that kind of position. Okay, though, it was a different era, it was a different time, different dynamics. But, we've got to wait. Pacific speaks for itself, and I'm delighted that Penny Wong has done so well in her first visit there. I mean, it was, again, pitch perfect, the tone of that speech that she made. It's worth reading to the Fiji, in Fiji, to the assembled foreign ministers. We've begun the long haul back, particularly, on climate, obviously, which is a game changer. COVID, we'll have to do more, pandemics in the future. Security, we've made the point, and we can start building things there. But we're going to have to do more in the South Pacific, and I suspect it's going to have to be particularly in that area of work visas, where we've been very cautious about opening the doors. But I think opening the doors to the South Pacific Islanders coming to Australia to work is absolutely crucial in terms of developing a confident relationship. That's the storyline. We've got to work hard.
Yeah. And finally, briefly, a lot of this, things like the Chemical Weapons Convention, things like Cambodia, the great achievements you had, built on a formidable diplomatic instrument.
Well, the last of my challenges I mentioned was restoring diplomacy to centre stage. It's been one of the great tragedies of Australian public policy that the way in which DFAT has been hollowed out, Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade has been hollowed out and marginalised over the last quite a few years. It's just the securitisation of Australian foreign policy. I'm speaking to a former defence official and a brilliant one at that, but people like Hugh White should not be running foreign policy.
No bad job.
You're contributing to foreign policy, developing it together, as I did with Beazley, I did with Robert Rowe. We had a very constructive relationship, as I did with you, Hugh. But, intelligence community. It's an intelligence community. It's not a foreign policy making or delivering community. But now, under the previous government, Morrison government, all our foreign policy was driven by a combination of the intelligence community, which has now become monolithic rather than internally different agencies being very contestable, and the Defence Department, Home Affairs, security crowd there, and the Prime Minister's office, and Foreign Affairs just completely marginalised. In my time, Foreign Affairs was a brilliantly professional part of the public service, really ranked high internationally, hugely qualified people. Still got a lot of very good people there, but they have completely had their morale destroyed, and that confidence is going to need rebuilding. That's got to be a very high priority for Penny, and I'm sure she's onto it. You cannot do this stuff, navigate these very complex international relationships in this very volatile environment we have without having a super sophisticated, super professional foreign policy service which is respected and which is just indispensable part of the machinery. So that's the challenge. I've got a great deal of confidence that that one will be met, but there's a long way to go in rebuilding that capability.
All right, Gareth. Well, look, we better draw a close there. Here's hoping that the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade will be buying about 5,000 copies of the book. But seriously, thank you very much for that exposition. Thanks for coming along tonight. Thanks, of course, to the Hawke Centre for making all of this happen.